Okay, can you? No, you can't see. Can you see now?
It's saying you're starting screen sharing.
Okay. It should, okay. You can see my presentation?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
You can?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, where do I put you? I don't know. Let's see. Good. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. As I said, it only took a year for me to come here and to talk to you. And I couldn't figure out what to talk to this group about, to be honest with you. So it took me a while to decide on that. And I didn't want to, talk about stuff that you probably hear a lot of times. So you won't hear a talk about synchrony or, about hyperscanning, etc. So I'm going to try to show you some different kind of evidence, I hope. And I'm also, if we get to the end, so we'll see, I have some thoughts, I guess, some preliminary or last thoughts for the presentation. And I would really love to hear your thoughts on my thoughts, to be honest. So this will be a bit of an experiment for me as well. But yeah, my title is Predictable Patterns and Surprising Turns. And basically, what I would like to start with is sort of the not very new suggestion that we humans, we like predictability. We like what's coming our way. We prefer predictable conditions, and we do not like unpredictability or chaos. If you can see it at the global scale politically, what's happening in the world around us, but also at a more micro scale, like in social interactions. So we constantly evaluate our reality based on what we expect that reality to be, or what it should be according to us. And when there is a conflict between our expectations and the reality, we then talk about, different people call it different things, but in some field, we call it incongruence, right? So there is sort of like this breaking of expectation. And then this incongruence, we either try to solve it, or we adjust our expectations, or we do both. And this is, as I said, not entirely new. So there is this predictive processing framework, as you probably all know. And this reasoning is sort of aligned with that framework. So in an organism constantly computes sort of the probability of events in the environment based on sort of the sensory input the organism gets, and it generates appropriate responses to the environment. And then sort of the task of the organism is to minimize prediction errors. And to do that, the brain must increase the accuracy of sort of its internal predictive models. And this process enables then smooth and coordinated social interactions. And in turn, this is then the basis for self-regulation and control. So sort of in this preface, or based on sort of this framework, I would like to talk about today about a lot about predictions, but also a little bit about unpredictability. So, and how sort of this plays out in early social interaction. So I will talk about some studies that I've done examining whether and how infants are actually able to predict interactive structures and behaviors of others. And then I will also talk about whether and when can we observe unpredictability in social interactions with infants, and that are actually not interpreted negatively. So let me just jump right into it. Sorry, I have two screens, so I need to find my mouse constantly. But, yeah, sure, go ahead.
On your previous slide, when you talked about regulation, increased self-regulation and control, what age group are you looking at, and how do you define self-regulation?
So really, I will talk about an age group of in infants, so birth to maybe 18 months, 20 months, so in the first 2 years of life. But this is sort of meant as a more general statement, right? So it's not necessarily only regulatory control in infants, but also in adults in terms of kind of executive functioning and so on. So it goes, it's a wider thing that is meant here. But in general, I will talk about infants. Okay, so let's start with sort of the first of these three topics. And early sort of social interactions or early engagement with infants are built up around routines. So, for example, taking turns or relying on a particular pattern of interactions. And these routines start, in fact, at birth, when infants are involved in sort of goal-directed routines, functional routines, oftentimes, such as having a diaper change or being fed. And these routines are characterized by the fact that they are repetitive in their action sequence. They are performed at sort of particular times and in particular places, of course, with some adjustment depending on the routine. And the most important thing is that they are dynamic and they require continuous adjustment of both interactants in terms of physical coordination between both the mother, the parent, the caregiver, and the infant. And because otherwise these routines won't work, right? So if you want to change the diaper of a baby that doesn't want to have the diaper change, if you've experienced that situation, then you know it's a very difficult situation and very frustrating one for parents. So you need this sort of dynamic adjustment of both partners, and sort of this. It starts at birth, and this extensive practice in coordinating with others' actions, others' goal-directed movements, and also objects that are involved, like a bottle or a diaper, increases infants' sort of sensitivity to the behavior of the caregiver, and it allows them to sort of build up expectations about others' behavior. And so in participating, so the assumption is participation in these meaningful, functional social routines allow babies to sort of make predictions about others' behaviors. Yeah. One of those sort of functional routines is being picked up. It is a very common experience. Babies experience that from birth. And that particular routine is very dependent on that the baby cooperates in the routine, right? So if you have tried to pick up someone or carry someone who doesn't want to be carried, you know how difficult that may be. Of course, we as adults are much stronger than babies and we can easily pick them up without them coordinating. But it is much easier and much more safe in this case also to have their cooperation, right? Because if babies can hold up their neck, if they stiffen their bodies, it's much easier for us to pick them up, and we can prevent injuries. But up until we did our study with Vasser Reddy, there was really only anecdotal evidence of this sort of action of being picked up and how babies sort of behave in that routine. And so we tried to address this gap. And looked at anticipatory adjustments in infants in the first year of life while being picked up by their mothers. So we had babies starting actually at 2 months, but up until 6 months of age. So we did a little bit of a longitudinal study, but really our most robust findings we found with 3-month-old babies. And so just to show you a video. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. It goes very fast, so I might play it several times. I hope you can see it more smoothly than I can because it's a
Oh,
bit
it's a bit
choppy for
jaggedy.
me. It's a bit choppy, right? There is no sound, but let me just try to play it again. I'm not sure if that's my internet. So basically, let me stop here. Okay. So basically, what we did is we told the moms to sort of chat with the baby as she usually would, and eventually, when she feels like it, pick the baby up, right? And the only precondition we gave her sort of was to, we wanted the baby to see her approach of the arms, of her hands. And you can't really, I'm sorry that the video is so choppy, but you can't really see it properly. But what we found is that at 3 months, we also saw it at 2 months, but at 3 months it was robust. Babies did some adjustment in their body posture according to the state, the behavior that the mothers did. So already so you saw maybe in the beginning, the baby was thrashing a little bit, maybe some uncontrollable movements of the limbs. And then as soon as the mom approached the baby with her hands, we saw a lot of stilling of the body. We saw tension build up. We saw a reduction in this general movements, in this thrashing, and you can see it here in this video. But please trust me or believe me when I say this particular 3-month-old baby also lifted her head, and that all happened even before the mom picked up the baby, right? So during the approach and after the contact at the infant body, the babies made specific adjustment. Also, what I didn't mention, sort of lifting up the arms to make room for the hands and so on, right? And so we saw that is particularly the onset of the hands moving towards the infant that evokes these postural changes, right? And so we thought, well, this is really neat. They anticipate sort of her behavior, this routine that they participated in from birth and being picked up, right? And they adjust their behaviors in this case accordingly. But functional routines such as this one, or having a diaper change, or being fed, and so on, are not the only routines that infants actually experience early in life. So throughout the first year of life, they also begin to co-construct social games, such as peekaboo or I'm gonna get you. And these games are characteristic in that they follow a particular set of rules and sequences that are easily observable. At different levels also, so at the motor level, at the vocal level, so they are simple rhymes or simple songs that are often associated with some appropriate motor movement, so they are often multimodal, not always, but often. And so the important thing is here that social game routines have a clear, repeated, recurring structure. And again, the assumption would be that this sort of repetition allows infants to follow some, elementary rules in their social interactions. The peekaboo, as shown here, is actually the best examined playful routine, and the structure actually has been mapped out of this routine. So we know there are 3 basic phases in the peekaboo game, and the moms or the caregiver has the potential to put in some optional phases, like a preparation or as an extra waiting phase between when he or she covers their faces, right? But besides the peekaboo, we know very little about actually how these social game routines naturally occur and what kind of routines occur and how infants participate in them, what the structure is, what their function is, and so on. So really, just by accident, I guess, I had this set of data from a project where we had so the goal of the project was to examine oxytocin and its role in social interactions and early social interactions. And because we didn't really know sort of the time frame of how oxytocin reacts, we had quite a long natural interactions between mothers in this case and their 3-month-old babies, which was 10 minutes long, which was quite long for, without any toys, and the moms were just told to interact with their babies as they usually would. And just, I guess by accident, we observed in this very long natural interaction that moms did a lot of these games that, very diverse, very different. And the important thing, they were not really instructed to play. They were instructed to interact. So this was kind of like a neat sort of random observation. And then we went through all the video material and actually looked particularly for these games. So I'm just going to show you a specific game. I hope this video works better. It is a Czech sample, so you won't understand what she's saying, but maybe some of you know it's a game where, the doctor comes and he knocks on the door, and then he brushes the feet on the mat, and then he goes into the house. So that's sort of the basic structure of the game. And the game ends with the caregiver putting his or her finger in the mouth of the baby, because that's where the doctor goes, right? And so maybe just have a look at the reactions of the baby while the mother goes through these steps of the game.
A šel pan doktor na návštěvu, zaťukal, zazvonil, otřel boty, už tam byl. Už to kouše. Jo.
So here as well, we see these anticipatory, mouth openings. So it's sort of this knowledge, oh, I know exactly where this is going. So I'm gonna, participate, I'm gonna cooperate, I'm gonna coordinate, however you want to call it. But the neat thing was we found actually in almost 80% of the diets, we found these games, and they occurred spontaneously. And in this particular sample, we found 47 different types of these games. So it's not just peekaboo routine or I'm going to get you, but there are many, many more. And mind you, I give you that this may be a cultural thing, and maybe in Czech there are many more sort of these rhymes and games that mothers play. So it may actually be something that is context specific.
Gabby,
But yeah.
So how exactly are you defining game here? Are you kind of anything that's kind of interactive, or anything that involves kind of repeated use of language, or what exactly was your definition?
So we wanted the games to have some kind of verbal component, so like a rhyme or a song, and then we wanted some kind of actions to be seen, on the infant body, or the mothers does some action. So the definition was it was supposed to be multimodal. Mind you, at that point there is no literature still on how you define these sort of games. So these are criteria that we sort of made up, but it worked well because we could really nicely distinguish between sort of a social natural interaction and these games. So that was a really clear distinction. And again, I give you that it might be a cultural thing, right? So I'm Czech originally, so in Czech we know all these games, sort of they are omnipresent, and I'm not sure if that is actually the case in other languages or in other cultural contexts, right? So I think this is a very idiosyncratic thing for this sample, but regardless, I think it's a really neat finding. But then we also looked at, during these games. Sorry, did I answer your question, Sam?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So is it like the physical interaction? Is it the language? Is it the rhythm of the song? And was that ever compared to something, say, using the language to say that you're going to get a bottle or something like that? So there's an interaction with language that isn't a game.
Right. So this was not that systematic, so we didn't really look at the rhythm, for example, right? But sort of the specification or the operationalization of this was there was supposed to be a rhyme or a song, and usually that is very rhythmic, right? and then this motor movements that go along with with the content of the song, right? Or the rhyme. We compared those, the behavior of the baby and also of the mother during these routines with the rest of the interaction. So I guess in a way you could say we, controlled for normal infant-directed speech that is not maybe particularly rhythmic beside whatever rhythm there is in infant-directed speech. But it wasn't that systematic that we looked particularly for cases where there may be some rhythmic speech without any playful elements, if that's what you're asking, right? So I can't really say anything about that. But what we try to do is compare, the behaviors within these routines versus the rest of the interaction, and infants showed more positive affect, so increased positive affect during these routines in comparison to the rest of the interaction. And I think the interesting part here is that the interaction was particularly long. And a lot of times there was sort of a lull in the interaction, and because there were no toys involved, mothers, oftentimes you could see, and that is of course very anecdotal from my side, you could see sort of this, okay, what should I do next? Is it over already? Like, this kind of feeling, okay, what can I do? Like, I have another 5 minutes to go. And in we saw that the games occurred particularly in these lulls. Again, I cannot show you the math for it because I didn't compute it at that time. But it was sort of like we saw an increase in engagement when mothers sort of use these games, right, in the infant. So again, increase in positive affect, increase in social gaze, and so on. And also there was sort of like a regulatory component to it. So oftentimes also you could see the mothers sort of using these games when they started to see the baby starting to fuss a little bit, right? You see this emerging negative affect, and then the mother jumps in with this kind of routine, and then sort of it dies down again. So it seems to be, again, this is not a systematic examination, just like a first observation of this. It seems like that they used this as like a tool, as a caregiving tool. It felt comfortable to know these games, they have a structure, they know what to do, they have played these games before, most likely, and they know babies respond to it. Right? So it's sort of like this comforting that they're doing, they have control over the interaction, they have like a bridge towards maybe other parts of the interaction so it can go somewhere else, right? So, and they see immediate results. And so it seemed like mothers used this as sort of this tool to re-engage the infants, to regulate them down, maybe to re-engage again with them. And as I said in the beginning, this was a project where we measured oxytocin, and we actually saw that the increase in maternal oxytocin from before to after this interaction was related to an increased rate of these games and also in a more time spent in these games. And this is really interesting, I think, because in light of sort of this, it's not so new anymore, it's already 5 years, but it's sort of this proposal of oxytocin playing a role in social allostasis. Allostasis is sort of the process of maintaining stability through changing, so when the environment is changing, by anticipating future changes. So that's sort of the basic definition of allostasis. And then Quintana and Guastella, they proposed that oxytocin, the oxytocin system actually facilitates this allostasis. So oxytocin is responsible for anticipating change in the future, and it adjusts the physiological set points, as they call them, to better cope with this change, right? And so this is sort of an interesting thing, right? That the oxytocin actually sort of seems to facilitate stability in an environment that may be challenging, that may be changing. And then in that way, it facilitates also, as proposed by Dan Quintana, learning and prediction and response and so on. So I think this is a really interesting sort of part of the story, right? That oxytocin is somehow involved in this prediction of environment or of structure in a way. And I will come back to this. Yeah, sorry.
So sorry, could I ask you a question on the previous
sure.
slide?
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I think this is a bit of a dumb question, but and I think I'm misunderstanding this, but if the idea is that oxytocin is about changing physiological set points in response to changing environments, and through that it facilitates stability, but surely if the environment is changing, the physiological set point is going to need to change all the time, and oxytocin is going to be changing all the time. So what's the sort of stability idea here?
So the idea here is that the allostasis part, where oxytocin is implicated, sort of works together with the homeostasis part, right? So homeostasis is sort of this post hoc change. So of course the environment is constantly changing, right? And then so we need a sort of homeostatic change, but at the same time we need sort of, so our brain sort of demands it, if you allow me sort of that language, that we have this prediction, we have anticipation, and that is facilitated by oxytocin, right? So they sort of both work together, allostasis and homeostasis. But Dan Quintana, he argues that actually allostasis is more important. I guess that's a point where you could have a broad discussion about it, right? But the point is, I think here, what he tries to do, or what he tried to do with this model, sort of consolidate evidence that oxytocin is not only involved in social processes, but also non-social, right? So if you have knockout mice and they don't have the oxytocin gene or receptor, then they still can function properly. But if you put them in a maze, then you see that they don't really, they don't find their way around in a maze. So there is this weird kind of thing, that weird idea we have of oxytocin as being this social facilitator in a way, right? But what Dan Quintana is arguing, that it's actually a broader thing that the oxytocin system does. And in his idea is that it is the anticipatory process that it facilitates.
Okay, thank you.
But oxytocin, it's sort of a love-hate for me, I guess. Oxytocin is so complex and it changes constantly on what you can find, and it's so dependent on conditions, context, measuring vials and whatever. So I think it's not the end of the story here, but I find this really an interesting framework maybe to consider, I guess.
And Gabby, just quickly, just to add to this, I know you've got
go
to
ahead.
get to, I'm sure, but
This
idea of allostasis, it's partly about, because predictability, we're doing lots of people on the call are doing, different aspects of predictability. One is this idea of rhythms that you've been talking about, but another is the idea of contingency, right? So, I do something, my baby does something, and I reliably react in a particular way. Yeah. And they're both kind of different types of predictability, but they're very different. One comes entirely from the parent creating the rhythm, and the other comes entirely from the baby doing something, which then reliably elicits a response. But would both of those be equally important, kind of for this idea you're talking about?
I think so. I mean, I just can't guess, but I think yes. Because I mean, in a way, it's a different type of coordination that you're describing, but it's a type of coordination, right? Or synchrony, or whatever you may call it. I mean, there are different aspects that we can say what it is, whatever it is. So yes, I would say yes. Okay. So I think it's an interesting idea that sort of routines, and maybe specifically the playful ones, could be used in a regulatory sort of way by, inducing stability or by increasing stability and predictability, right? And so we sort of tried to examine this idea by looking at the association between these playful routines and maternal stress. And we used the Peekaboo game specifically for this study. And so sort of the idea behind it was this interesting dichotomy of play. So on the one hand, we know play, it necessitates sort of conditions of well-being. And we know from animal studies that so the animal research suggests that the play is reduced or it sort of goes away when an animal is in distress, so when circumstances are not optimal. But on the other hand, it could potentially be that, by being involved in this routine, game routines could facilitate prediction, and through their fixed structure, they could actually alleviate stress. So, there's this interesting thing that may be going on that we tried to tap into. And so we used the Peekaboo game, and I already showed this to you, the structure that was mapped out by Nomiku and colleagues. And so the measures we used for this was sort of very generally the duration of the play and how many Peekaboo rounds they played. But then we also used a measure of game variability. So we looked at sort of the ratio of how many or how long optional phase they engaged in optional phases, and sort of to have a measure of game variability, sort of to see whether and how they expanded sort of the basic structure of the game, right? And so this was a longitudinal study, but particularly this part took place when infants were 15 months of age. And so they were, just instructed, the mothers were instructed to play the Peekaboo game as long as they wished and however they wished. And so just very quickly, the results. So we found that so the longer mothers played with their babies, this sort of Peekaboo game, we found an association with higher perinatal stress. So stress was assessed in the study sort of from the first trimester until the postpartum period, right? And so the more stress she reported in this sort of period, the longer she played also. And the lower she reported her baby to rank on the IBQ effortful control. And we also found some association with game variability. So again, the more stressed mothers reported during the perinatal period, the more game variability they introduced into the basic structure of the game, right? So in a way,
Question?
yeah, so sorry, go ahead.
I guess that from what has been said so far, we're talking about mothers playing with their babies explicitly. And I was wondering, because there are these ideas that the father play is qualitatively different to the mother play. So fathers most of the times engage in a more active way of playing. And if the premise behind that is indeed regulation, then sometimes when a baby is already frustrated, this play is actually impacting the situation on the opposite direction, like making the babies more frustrated. So that, like in terms of expectations and the environment and failure of expectations, then is this somehow impeding the learning process of using play as a regulatory mechanism? Because I would assume that if a baby is expecting like a game moment, and then the game moment comes, but it's very stimulating, so it just works the other way around, could be a bit influential to the learning.
So there are a couple of different aspects that you address. So one, fathers, I think that's a very interesting thing. And like I just changed institutions, so I'm now at a medical university in Salzburg, and we sort of specifically look at fathers and how fathers interact and how they engage in these playful routines as well, right? But also in the family system dynamic, how how this sort of intertwines with whatever the mother does. So, but I can't really tell you anything more about it because there are really no studies on the fathers. We know that they are more physical with their baby, right? Or with their child in general. But there are very few studies that have actually examined sort of specifically these playful routines. There are no studies with fathers. But I think it's an interesting avenue in a way. Sorry, go ahead.
I think Ruth Feldman did one that I
Yeah.
remember reading that was there was more cycles between intense. It's very consistent with what
Right. But it
Like,
wasn't play in
positive
particular.
affect. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't play in particular, so it would be really interesting also in terms of like you know they are more physical as you already mentioned, and sort of in terms of when we think of rough and tumble play, I know it's a bit of a stretch, right? But still, you know, these could and we know that rough and tumble play actually increases social competence in children and also in animals, right? And so it could sort of, in a way, be that, you know, there are some interesting things that we don't see in interactions with the mothers, right? At the same time, I have to say, so these were content babies. So the play sort of, this was not a situation where there may have been a social disturbance, right? And the mothers tried to regulate their baby. But this was an interaction that followed a natural interaction, and the babies were sort of content and they were ready sort of to play. So of course, talk about regulation here is not. I can't really say anything about momentary regulation, but we also didn't look at the baby's behavior in this particular study, right? We looked at how the mothers play and how that sort of changes with whatever stress level she may report. And so I think you are completely right. I think it's a very context dependent thing. And it could backfire definitely to sort of try to regulate the baby with something that is not appropriate in that particular moment. So yes, but in this study we really didn't measure that. Not sure I answered all your questions.
Yeah, fully. Thank you.
So coming back to this, I mean, in a way, these was not the results that we expected. So really what I expected to find is, you know, the more stress she reports, the less play she shows, because it would have been consistent with kind of like, you know, the animal models and all these kind of work on, you know, how stress sort of impedes creativity and flexibility and all of that. But we really didn't find that. And so in a way, one could sort of maybe suggest, you know, in a way, the predictability of this sort of game, it allowed maybe the mother, especially when she was feeling stressed or, you know, an increased stress, offering sort of like her a way to sustain engagement with the baby, especially maybe if the baby was not particularly well regulated, maybe potentially. And so it may sort of work as a stabilizing framework for the mother, but also for the baby, right? So I'm just going to throw it out there, and this isn't sort of not the last word, I guess, but it could sort of play this regulatory function. So let me just quickly go through a summary. Or maybe I just skipped the summary just because of the time. And another sort of way to look at predictability, which in recent sort of months I found very fascinating, is to look at meaningful sequences in naturally occurring caregiver behavior. And so one way to quantify this is to look at entropy of a sequence of parental behaviors or signals. And so this is based on an idea by Davis and colleagues, and what they sort of do is look at sensory signals that caregivers are using. So they use visual and tactile and auditory signals, and then they look at the predictability in the sequence, right? So this time series that you sort of see here is then used to compute transitional probabilities, such as shown in this matrix. And so in a way, so for this example that is circled here, for this one particular mother, it is one example, 79% of the time when this mother was engaged in auditory and tactile stimulation, this was followed by tactile stimulation. So, sorry, right? So this was a very strong conditional probability, and so this is how you sort of read the matrix. And so by measuring entropy, sort of that's the other spectrum, right? So we look at how much is she predictable in her behavioral sequences for the baby, right? And entropy means how much is her behavior random or unpredictable. So there are really not many studies on sort of the outcomes for the child between parental entropy and then and infants. So most of the studies in human children looked at older children or school-age children even, but what is interesting here that they found that in children there is poor cognitive performance, poor memory, poor effortful control, and also we found some blunted cortisol response. We found some differences in the cortical limbic pathway development. I'm sorry. Interestingly, this entropy measure has been studied in animals, and most of the time in rodents, but also in non-human primates. And so this sort of comparison, I think, with humans is also very interesting. And so in animal models, they found that mice were more depressive, showed more depressive and anxiety behaviors, more impaired social behaviors, memory deficits when their caregivers' behavior were unpredictable. And there were also some, altered HPA axis, altered the gene expressions, altered structural changes in the limbic regions. So in a way, unpredictability of parental behavior seems to have negative impacts on child development. And particularly if you look at sort of the mixture that it's shown here, it sort of suggests that it might be executive functioning, and potentially regulation, right? And also some susceptibility to stress. So this is what sort of like the pattern looks like for these outcomes. Again, these are not infants most of the times. These are school children that they, or older children that they examined for the humans.
Gabby?
Yes.
Actually, maybe you might go on. I'll save the point actually, because you might be going on to say exactly this point. So I'll save it. If you haven't said it, I'll come back to it.
Okay, sure. So what is interesting for us sort of is what predicts sort of this unpredictability, right? And then there has been little studies, well, actually on this sort of entropy, this measure, there are not many studies on this, but the studies that are out there show that maternal anxiety and problems in regulation are important predictors of unpredictability, right? And also her sensitivity. So lower sensitivity is an important predictor of her unpredictability. All of the studies are done with mothers, actually, in this case. So we might again wonder what's the case for fathers, right? And so the idea here is a bit that there are conditions that impact the predictability of parental behaviors towards their children. And this is an important one especially when you look at sort of the transgenerational transmission of stress in families, right? We know that it is a thing. It is being talked about in scientific research, but also like in public health spheres. And so this unpredictability could potentially be a tool of how this transition or transmission works at the behavioral level. So what about maternal stress? Is it something that may, make her behavior more unpredictable? And again, I was thinking a long time to present you this because, yeah. But anyways, I mean, there are not really any published studies on this, but there are some colleagues of mine, Samira Abouaish and Catherine Monk from Columbia University, with whom I'm doing this research on. And they have examined a sample of adolescent Hispanic mothers. So these mothers were on average 18 years of age. So that in itself is already a risk factor. And they looked at her reports of stress and then the unpredictability or this entropy of her sensory signals in interaction with the baby at 4 months and at 14 months. And they actually find an association. It is not published data yet, but they're finding an association between prenatal stress of these mothers and unpredictability at 4 months, but not then with toddlers at 14 months.
So Gabby,
Yeah.
so this, the point that I was going to make earlier, I think it is relevant here. So Katie Lancaster, are you there? Are you in the room?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, so Katie's doing some very, very similar analyses at the moment for her PhD. And one of the things that we've noticed is, so this kind of the Davis UCLA stuff, it very much treats, the mum as either predictable or not predictable. And it's very much a chain of causation from the mum to the baby. But just as you were saying beautifully in the last part of your talk, it's in fact not quite like that, because we know that mothers' behaviors are very dependent on the baby, and they're continually adapting what they're doing depending on the baby. Yeah. So if I've got a baby who's more fidgety and more unpredictable, my own behaviors are going to come across as more unpredictable according to this coding scheme, just because I'm responding to the baby. Yeah. But if you look at it another way, if you measure the contingency of the mother on the baby, then they might be highly predictable. Yeah. So we think, I mean, we've been talking a lot about this with Katie. So it's a kind of an important point that, if you're looking at predictability correlating with infant emotional control, it might just be because the baby's more unpredictable and the mum is very, very predictably following the baby.
Right. So I think this is a really interesting idea, and you could criticize this sort of entropy measure a lot. I mean, mind you, there is a contingency upon infant visual behavior. So this is calculated. This is sort of based on, the baby establishes visual contact with the mother, and then the contingency is sort of calculated based on that. But that's it, pretty much. So you're completely right in saying, the sort of the perspective of the baby is mostly missing here, right? So, and I think sort of these results that I'm showing you here from my own sample are sort of underline this sort of idea that it is not an ideal measure, maybe because we find no association between maternal stress and unpredictability. So, it seems to be, I have some ideas why this may be the case, and this might be one of them. Another might be that, this unpredictability or this entropy kind of measure sort of indicates some interactive idiosyncrasies, right? That may not be subject to sort of momentary changes. Like, for example, you would see for sensitivity and so on, which might be dependent on the particular mood and so on, right? So I find this measure, despite all these problems, I think really interesting, sort of tapping into this predictability, unpredictability issue, right? And so I'm gonna.
Sorry, could I?
You go first.
Sorry, could I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
Thank you. How do you? Sorry if you covered this. How do you distinguish stress that happens prenatally from stress that's happening at the time of the experiment or at the time that you're measuring? Because my guess is probably that's super highly correlated.
So, we have no measure in both of these samples of the momentary stress, right? So all of the stress is sort of reported during the prenatal and postpartum period, right? And it's sort of, but we see a very, at least in our sample, there is a large stability in the stress the mothers report. So we see no really changes in stress. So if they're high, they remain high. So it seems like to maybe reflect some kind of, general stress level, anxiety, whatever you might want to call it. But we have no measure at that time where we measured the unpredictability. So of course we can't really say. And again, these were content babies, right? So we have no measure of how for example, some ECG or anything, any measure of arousal or anything that we might link this to. The one thing that we have in our sample, in the Salzburg sample, is we have a measure of oxidative stress in urine, which we are trying out now. So we are thinking that, you know, sort of oxidative stress in the organism is sort of linked to physical stress, and it might also be linked to psychological stress. And we are trying this measure out right now. But again, the way we are measuring it is not a momentary sort of thing or change that we are looking at, but sort of like a retrospective or an accumulation of stress that we're looking at.
That's one of the things that
Yeah.
Katie. Yeah. Candice, do you mind if we just ask you to email Gabby's question, because we've got 5 minutes
Yeah,
left?
no worries.
Just like there's a whole nother section that Gabby wants to get through.
Oh, I don't really mind.
No, it's nice. I'd like to hear it, Kate.
I don't really mind. I just wanted to show you maybe sort of like a contrast, right? So we were talking about predictability and the importance of how important predictability is. But I want to show you a case where actually unpredictability is fun, right? And it's in the case of humor. So we know, just browsing through very quickly, that babies are very, you know, upset when their expectations are violated. We know it from the still phase. We know it from some other paradigms. But there is this other incongruence, right? In some cases, someone does something that is unexpected and the reaction is a positive one, right? I'm just going to skip this, and maybe this is sort of the basic idea of humor, right? Sorry. At least by 3 months of age, parents are starting to sort of insert absurdities in their interactions. So they starting to do like some unexpected things, right? And the reaction of the baby is not a negative one. Rather, the babies oftentimes, they laugh. And so I'm going to show you just very quick videos of me and my second son, sort of to illustrate these absurd things that I'm doing now in this video. And sorry, here, to sort of illustrate what the reaction is of the baby. So you see sort of this absurd thing that I'm doing, like blowing raspberries, right? I think that's what you call it, on a baby's stomach. And of course, I'm routinizing it because I'm realizing, oh, he really likes it. He's laughing, and I'm repeating it. And so it's like a spiral that we are engaged in, right? But sort of to demonstrate, this is something that, you know, usually you don't really do in social interactions, right? You don't do like, and when someone does it, and it is an unexpected thing, and the context is right, then this is something that is joyful, and that's sort of the underlying basis for and investigating early humor, right? So at least by 6 months. So we start doing it very, you know, spontaneously as parents, as caregivers in our early interactions at 3 months. But at 6 months, you know, we see this sort of reversal in roles, and babies start, you know, engaging in this, what Vasu already calls clowning. So they are, you know, purposefully violating rules and norms. They, you know, repeat actions that others laughed at before, and so on. And so they're purposefully trying to get this sort of reaction out of you as well. So, you know, it is this play with this, with these unpredictable behaviors, maybe, you know, that may become predictable, mind you, as you see here, you know, through repetition and through this routinizing of the behavior that we are doing. So just to give you an idea, and I had this whole thing planned. I have no time to go through it, but just to give you sort of like a nudge, I guess. There are, of course, several theories of how to consolidate these sort of this evidence of, you know, on the one hand, predictability is important, but on the other hand, there are, you know, there is this joy of engaging in something that is unpredictable, right? And that is appreciated by both babies and caregivers. And so there are different kind of theories or frameworks that might look at or explain this sort of seeming controversy, but there are actual mathematical models that provide an answer, and one of them stems from the from the chaos theory. And just have a look, Google chaos theory, Google Steve Strogan's. He has this really nice introductory lecture on this, and sort of the gist of it is that stability, yes, is a very important thing. It is a precondition to change, but chaos is sort of a precondition to stability, right? So that is sort of the gist of the chaos theory. It's a mathematical thing, and I'm sure some of you can calculate the math. I can't. I could just explain it to you, maybe in a more abstract way. But sort of what I would like to argue sort of for that there is significance for both predictability and unpredictability, and there is the math to support it. And so I think it's I'm right on time, right? Like right on time.
Perfect. Right, let's give Gabby a big round of applause. That was really fantastic. There's so much overlap, like everything you said about there's a lot of people in the lab who
It's great. I would love to hear, your thoughts, or just email me with your
are you in the
questions.
room, Pierre?
Yes.
Were you happy? But there's a bit of humor. Pierre always wants to be talking about humor and things. Well, have we got time for one quick question? If anyone, particularly anyone who hasn't asked one yet, or anyone who has. I mean, okay. Were you going to ask one, Nishal? No. Can I just ask one really quick one? So, because we think of that in terms of the Wundt arousal curve, that if it's mildly unexpected, it's pleasurable. If it's extremely unexpected, it's unpleasurable. And I was thinking about the relationship between the positive affect displays in the first kind of rhythmic interactions type thing, and that type of kind of laughing that you get in the unexpected. Yeah. So is it that is it that you get the same thing when you're doing one of those rhythmic interactions? It's exciting, so you laugh. Yeah. But then I wonder if you could ever get it to the point where it's too exciting that you don't laugh, or whether it's two different things. One is, smiling is a social signaling that I like this, i.e. I'm learning from it, i.e. it fits well to my brain, versus the kind of the smiling, which is that Wundt curve, which is, this is mildly exciting.
Right. So this is a really interesting question, because for a long time we thought, laughter is sort of like this relief of stress, right? In a way, but that actually sort of contradicts some parental reports where they say their babies don't really laugh as a relief, but they laugh sort of at unexpected things, but I still think that the unexpected has to be, I don't want to say extreme, but I'm going to say extreme for the lack of a better word. It has to be very visible. It has to be very obvious, right? Otherwise, it won't elicit this sort of very strong emotional response. And I haven't had time to show you, but I have like sort of this video of the mom who is engaging in this sort of rhythmic games that I talked about, these social games. And then she pauses at sort of the height. So just before at the end of the game, right, she makes a little pause, right? And then sort of she continues, and that results in laughter. So sort of like this dramatic pause, we know it from the arts, right? We know it from theater, we know it from music, and so on, where we sort of break in some sort of way, the expectation, and it might result in this, but it might not. So we don't really know, right? And it depends probably on context, on many different things that I didn't touch upon.
Yeah, that was so interesting, Abby. And because as I say, virtually everybody, well, a lot of people on the call are working on really, really similar areas. So do email. And sorry, Candice, you didn't get a question that you wanted to ask.
Okay.
Very quickly, Emily Phillips, we should think about this for your fellowship, I was thinking as well, because a lot of this is quite high sensory load. We should think about that. But yeah, very relevant, as I say, for virtually everyone's. I haven't got time to chat about that. We'll chat about that later, Emily, because we've got another meeting now. But yeah, all right. Thank you so much, Gabby. It's really, really fun. And we'll be following up by email. Really, really.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay.
That's so kind of you. Thanks a lot then.
Have a good day. Bye. Thanks for having me. Bye.